Hi, welcome or welcome back if you are new here. I'm Ourielle the Stitch Witch, and today we're going to be talking about why knitting feels so intimidating to crocheters and how you can fix that, coming from a crocheter herself. So just as a little bit of background, in case you guys are finding this video new, I have been crocheting for the last 8 years or so, 7 years, 8 years, something like that. I started it as like a mental health thing back when I was in college, and I found it to be really useful for me in terms of like managing my anxiety, calming myself down, regulating my emotions, all that jazz. I wanted to make a separate video on how needlecraft in general has really helped to regulate and aid in my autism regulation, but needless to say, at the time I didn't know, and it was really helpful for me just to have something to work on. And crochet was the most accessible thing at the time. And for a while, and when I mean a while, I mean all those years that I was just crocheting, I never once felt like it would be tenable for me to be a knitter. And there were quite a lot of things that were, I guess, mentally in the way, and then also I think physically or like socially were also in the way, right? Like nothing was really stopping me, but I think there are just a few biases or just like little hurdles here and there that add up that make it a little bit harder for people who are crocheters to feel like it is a accessible and welcoming place for them to learn how to knit. And as someone who just learned how to knit recently within the last few months, and has really kind of found her people, I've really started to enjoy knitting for what it is and not necessarily feel a need to compare it to crocheting. There are two completely different things to me, and I just feel like if I had a systemic video really breaking down all these barriers and kind of like why the perception of those barriers is not true, or, you know, just kind of like assuaging my fears, I feel like I'd be better off. So in no particular order, I just wanted to kind of talk about, you know, in retrospect, what it is that I discovered as someone who went from crocheting to knitting, and, you know, I still do both. And then what you could do if you are someone who has, for whatever reason, like crocheted and felt like you could never learn to knit, or be like, just were kind of like off, if you were ever like off put for whatever reason. Hopefully these things can kind of serve as a debunking of these myths, or maybe you'll feel better somehow. Because if I got this video years ago, I think I would have started knitting a long time ago. The first thing I want to talk about in the knitting versus crocheting kind of like turf war, the beef, you know, is that like both sides of the aisle kind of have biased against each other, or at least it feels like that. And I don't necessarily think it's fair or accurate or reasonable, but I will say when I was a crocheter, knitting felt like something that, it's gonna sound really bad, but it felt like people who knit were always like putting down crochet as like, that's not really knitting, or like one day you're gonna actually learn how to knit, or like that's really cute, it's like a DIY hobby. And you'll start to see it in the sense that like, I think craft stores tend to be like crochet oriented, and like children's activities tend to be crochet oriented, and like a lot of the like more couture designs or like more commercial look stuff tends to be knit and not crochet. And so there's like a lot of implicit signs here and there that like crochet is not that serious. And a lot of people, like when you crochet, I don't know if I said that, sorry. A lot of people when you crochet are like, when are you gonna learn how to knit? Or yeah, like that's really like cute or whatever, but like come back when you actually have knit something. And I got that a lot, like from my own friends and family, where I would show them like a blanket that I crocheted or like a scarf or a hat or whatever. And they're like, oh, is that knitting? And I'm like, no, that's not knitting. And they're like, oh, it's crochet. So I think there actually is a great deal of stigma against crocheting. And then that in turn kind of turns the crocheter into like a little prickly, you know, hedgehog who doesn't necessarily want to learn how to knit, because knitting is filled with people who are snobs. Or knitting is for like those people. Yeah, I don't know. And then the other way around, where if you're a knitter, it's almost like you would never want to be called a crocheter because crochet is like beneath you, or it's like a craft hobby, but it's not knitting. And I don't think this is seen online in like the knitting and crochet community online, just because I think we're like very positive and uplifting people who like genuinely enjoy what we do. We want to spread the cheer. Like we love fibercraft, we love art, we love wool, we love like textiles and fabrics and DIY, and like there's a creative expression there. But I will say I've experienced a great deal of this in person. And usually, I don't want to say like from lay people, because that sounds like weird and like gatekeepy, but I will say it's like the kind of thing that like your grandmother will say, or your auntie will say, or your cousin will say, or your teacher will say it, or your best friend, or like your friend's friend, right? Or your mutuals, right? And people will just kind of say, like, it's clearly not trying to start beef, but I do think over time, as you bring your crochet out in public and people start talking to you, you'll start to pick up these comments, and they do feel quite derogatory. And I think it wounds the crocheter more than it wounds the knitter, because usually knit is put in like a higher pedestal, and then for that reason, like the underdog kind of has like a defensiveness about it. This is just like from my personal experience, but I definitely had an implicit bias against knitting because it was kind of like, oh, you should aspire to knit. Like one day you're actually going to learn how to knit. One day you're actually going to make something impressive. One day, blah, blah, blah. Like you should actually learn how to do this properly. And I think it turned me off of knitting for a really long time because I was just like, that's crazy. I don't know if that's the PDA talking. I have no clue. But yeah, that is just like one thing that I found it like a little bit like what's up with the knitting reputation, like what's up with this world where people are feeling comfortable saying that kind of thing. And kind of in the same lane, but not necessarily like exactly the same thing, is the idea that knitting tends to look, how can I say this? Knitting doesn't look like something you've done. I know that's not like reasonable to hear, but because crochet cannot be made through machinery, so so this is just a PSA. If you've seen like crochet items on Shein, if you've seen crochet items at like Cotton On or H&M or whatever, just know that it was made with unethical labor, or it is crochet-like, but not actually crochet. That's another thing. I guess like some places can like create a textile that looks like crochet, but it's actually printed, or it actually looks like crochet, but it's actually knit. But generally speaking, crochet has to be done by hand, and a lot of crochet work is just like not like affordable at a lower price point, or like a reasonable price point. And so what tends to happen is commercially machine knit items are more accessible outside, and crochet items are more things that people are making by themselves. So crochet blankets, crochet hats, you'll see a lot of like scarves, mittens, like, you know, bags, those kinds of things on the street. And they look DIY because they are DIY, because you can't actually crochet with a machinery. But when you look at knitted items and hand knitting and machine knitting and like loom knitting, they're all different hobbies, but they all kind of fall under knitting. And you'll see a lot of people who knit like sweaters that look like they bought them in the store. And that's partially because like knitting garments sometimes like are designed in that way where they're specifically trying to mimic a commercial garment. And it's also, I think, just because we're exposed to more like commercially knit goods. And so it looks very, like, I don't want to say fussy, but I will say as a crocheter who has been crocheting for a long time, I think having a little bit of that like rough around the edges art student look, and you know, that's also like what I'm professionally always trying to look like. Like I always kind of want to look like an art student. And I personally love that aesthetic. And so for me, looking at like knit products that are so perfectly polished and they don't look handmade and like they don't look like they have that like DIY touch right off the get, not only was it not appealing to me, it was also like, there's no way my products are going to look like that, because everything that I've made looks incredibly homemade. And now looking backwards, I know that it's not because my products were bad. I think it's just because there's just less commercial crochet, because really the only kind of commercial crochet I ever see is like Chloe, like Mosh. There are a lot of brands that are kind of like more higher end. Like I know Chanel did like a crochet collection. Like there are a lot of higher end, high fashion brands that do crochet, and I think it's because they can pay for like the labor of having people like crochet garments by hand, and then they charge like, you know, $3 grand for a dress or whatever. And like, so that's where you're seeing crochet garments. So again, in retrospect, that's fully like a market thing and not a me thing. But I do think that it makes knitting look really intimidating, because you're not sure like how on earth you're ever going to get your garment to look like a draped sweater from the street. You know, I feel like there's a gap between like seeing your little granny squares and then seeing something like a beautifully draped silk sweater in like a tiny little gauge, and you're like, there's no way I'm gonna make that, so I'm just not gonna bother, because that's just like not attainable given what I have and what I can do. Again, this is like it's not correct, and it's also, you know, it is just because of my ignorance, right? Like I didn't know at the time that there's just like a gap in the market. You know, there's a different culture around those two things, and it's actually not really that different, because there are plenty of people who have made crochet sweaters and crochet t-shirts and crochet tank top. Like that is a thing. But I think commercially you're more used to it being machine knit. And also when you look at like hand knit things, sometimes they do also look commercially made, partially because some of the designs are specifically looking for that look, and then partially because of the way that like we've been conditioned to like recognize knitting. The other reason why knitting seems a little bit like not super attainable as a crocheter, as someone who learned in their late teens and early 20s, is that it's kind of an older crowd. And again, I don't mean old as in like elderly, because let's face it, crochet also has a lot of older people, but I do just mean like the average content creator. And when I say that, I'm very much so speaking in the Gen Z world, where it's like, yeah, I will say most of my interactions with certain things that I do in my life really come from social media. And when we talk about the average age of the content creators that I was exposed to, most of the people on Pinterest and on Instagram and on YouTube that were crocheting were my age. People who looked like they were in college, people who looked like they were right out of college, even people who were younger than me. You know, we all know those like crazy, you know, arto kids in high school who are making like incredible sculptures and like really, really cool, you know, patchwork, grungy, punk, postmodernism, abstract, you know, garments that are also like installations at art museums. Like there are people who are really sick and talented from a really young age. And I think a lot of that really cool subversive art is crochet, and it's young and it's like fun and fresh. And I don't know if that's just like what my algorithm showed me, but generally I will say when I was looking at content online, the crochet stuff tended to be younger people, people who were my age, people who were teens and early 20s. But I will say, I think generally knitting, due to some other reasons I'll talk about later, the average, you know, content creator that I saw was maybe in their late 20s or in their early 30s. And there's, of course, a ton of people who are middle-aged and up. But I guess in terms of like the lower side of the spectrum, crochet was just easier for me to access. And when I was starting to crochet, because again, crochet was the first thing that I started really learning, that was more accessible to me. And so seeing these older people, and again, not much older, they're like my sister's age, these are not like old grandmas, but even just like a 10-year difference is enough to kind of place an identity barrier between you and the person who is like showing you the thing and then being like, okay, I guess I'm seeing enough people in their 30s do this, but I'm not seeing a lot of people who are in their 19s, you know, 20s, 21s doing this. And so I also feel like I should be doing this. So yeah, there was just like an idea that, for me, again, a misconception, because once you're in it, you can start to see a lot more diversity. But I still will say, even though I'm in the knitting community now, and you'll have to excuse my nasally voice, I'm hearing it and it's frustrating, but even now, spending as much time on like the fiber craft world as I am, there are fewer younger knitters. I will just say that. In general, I feel like, again, the knitters that I'm exposed to, that I see, that are popular, again, I would say late 20s, early 30s, tends to be popular. I think part of it is like the math and like the grading and all that jazz, and also the finances that come along with it. Again, I'll talk about that later. But again, with crochet, I feel like there's a lot more younger content creators who are doing crochet content, and especially, you know, on the other apps, I think like Ribbler is one. I think Lemonade is one. I know TikTok is another, but you know, there are Gen Alpha and Gen Z apps that I'm just not personally as active on, but at least, you know, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Pinterest, and on TikTok, I still feel like there is like that little age gap. At minimum, it's 5 years, maybe it's even more. The other thing I will say is that there's no exchangeability and there's no like pick up and go. With crochet, I really, really like the fact that you will never like run out of time to do a crochet. Like you just stop where you stop, you drop it, you move on. Nothing's gonna unravel. You don't need to count your rows. I mean, obviously, if you're working in the round, there are like spirals that you do, but you're never at risk of dropping stitches and then like losing all your progress. Whereas in knitting, you need to finish your row or you need to finish your something. And basically there's always a risk of you dropping your stitches, laying things down. You know, you need to like keep your knitting needles on that project until you're done with that project, and then you can take them off. Or you can do the thing where you like remove it and all that jazz. But I didn't know at the time about interchangeable needles, about the fact that there are like needle holders or like the wire stoppers. You can move things onto like barber wire and all that jazz. But you know, you need to really get into knitting before you realize that there are all these ways that you can kind of put your project on hold and then move on and use that needle to somewhere else. But from the perspective of a college student who has $30 to work on a project, and if you're asking me to spend another $11, $12 on another set of needles because I want to move on to a different project, that's really untenable to most people who are trying to save money and do this on a budget. Again, I will say now that the way to fix that is to recognize that there are ways to put your project on hold so that you can use that needle somewhere else. But I will also say, you know, that's something you had to learn going into the craft. But, you know, at this point, now you know. And it just feels a little bit like, again, not that there's anything wrong with knitting or that like it's knitting's fault that it's like that, but it did feel like another notch in like the accessibility of crochet, where I could make something, stop halfway, take out my hook, just leave a long loop so that way I don't like lose my yarn. But at the very least, like I can jump from project to project. My little ADHD brain can have like whatever she wants, and as long as I have the hook and I don't lose it, you know, I don't necessarily need to make repeat purchases of the same thing, unlike knitting where you do actually have to make repeat purchases, or you have to learn how to like get the tools to like hold your stuff and do it for later. And that's what I mean. Like, it is more expensive in general. And that's the other piece about it not being as accessible, is that I believe the common consensus is that knitting is more expensive than crochet. And again, the way to alleviate this is to recognize that it's not necessarily true. You don't have to spend more money on knitting. You don't have to buy better materials. You don't have to buy like expensive needles. You don't have to buy needle stoppers and like all these extra gadgets and gizmos and all that stuff. But I do think in general, it tends to be easier to start crochet on a smaller budget. I think it's, again, easier to purchase crochet supplies at like a big box store where you can use coupons. I think there's a wider variety of crochet, like up-to-date crochet books and like resources as compared to knitting, which didn't see as much of like a young person renaissance in the COVID era time, which I think is when a lot of like new books started coming out about needlework and stuff like that. And I also think the choice of yarns is different. But just in terms of like the basic tools, I will say, I think for knitting, you need more basic tools. And the way to alleviate that is, again, to be very, very selective and judicious about the order in which you're procuring materials. I was not like that to an extent. Again, I'm a bit of a collector, so I don't have a problem with having the mentality of like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to get stuff, because that's part of the fun. But if you're someone who is particularly mindful of budgeting, I will say, be very specific when you knit if you should like to go from crocheting to knitting. I would recommend going with maybe the same weight of project that you tend to do. So I know a lot of crochet tends to be weight for worsted weight yarn, because that's the majority, the vast majority of what I did was weight for yarn and up, or maybe a sport, but I never went below sport, which is the weight 3, right? And I think if you wanted to get the best bang out of your buck, you would just go to like a 5mm needle, you know, in knitting. And that way you don't have to necessarily buy a ton of needle sizes. However, the other economical thing to do is to get the interchangeable needle set, which would set you up for anything you want, any cord you want. And then if you want to make additions or subtractions, you'll have everything to like put your needles on hold, all that jazz. There are plenty of videos out there in the world that can help you break down whether or not you'd like to go interchangeable or fixed width needle sizes. And that's like an entirely separate discussion for another day. But just on paper, I do think knitting seems to require more specific materials, because it's not just like the hook width that you're looking at, which is like, you know, the 5mm, the 6mm, the 4mm, but it's also the length, you know, it's also type of material. It's also like, you'll need multiple ones for different parts of the body. So like you'll need one for the collar, one for the sleeves, like one for the body, you know, that kind of math tends to add up a little bit quicker. And especially if, you know, knitting stuff tends to be in its own store and not as much at like big box stores, you won't see a great variety of useful needles at something like a Michael's or a Joann's. And so yeah, there are like various levels of like the barriers to entry, right? Which I think is frustrating. And I will also say on that same topic, the technicalities of yarn weight and yarn fiber are not really as thoroughly discussed in crochet as they are in knitting. And things like blocking, things like drape, things like fiber care and construction, I don't know if it's just that like, again, maybe it's because the content creators are younger, maybe it's because the stuff I was exposed to was a little bit like more chill, but I will say, I got almost zero education on blocking, on shaping, on garment construction, on like the ways that like things are seamed together. You know, it was very like bootstrappy, which I think again is very punk. It's very cool, very anti-consumerist, very like, we're not going to buy a new thing just to buy a new thing. We're going to like figure this out ourselves. But I do think knitting has that as well. So again, it was like a miscommunication on my part, believing that, you know, I knew everything, but I didn't, right? I didn't. And it was unnecessary to feel like knitting is harder for these reasons. In fact, I feel like if I learned a lot of these tips earlier, my crochet would have been a lot better. And again, I learned crochet many years ago. So perhaps the education on crochet today is much more advanced. So I can't speak on what it's like to learn how to begin to crochet in 2024. I hope it's a lot better. But, you know, I will say from here on out, let me just tell you, like, try to work with better materials if you can. Not necessarily saying you have to in the beginning, nor am I saying that it makes like a night and day difference. But what I will say is materials that feel really satisfying from a sensory perspective, things that drape really nicely and don't look plasticky and they don't look bulky and they don't necessarily, unless you're looking for like that stiff bulky material for something like, I don't know, a basket or like a baby blanket. Like there are some times when you do want the material to do certain things. But I guess what I would say is the most important piece in knitting that I think I would rather have like retroactively applied to also crochet is really understanding the nuances of yarn, understanding yarn weight and gauge, and really understanding like, cause gauge was everything, you know, like not that it's not a thing, but it was very loosely a thing. And it wasn't ever really to express exactly how factor A, factor B, factor C all kind of like adjust in this like dynamic puzzle. It was very much so, this is the tutorial that I've made, this is the gauge that I hit, you want to hit this gauge so that way you can make this pattern too. And like ultimately that is what gauge is, but you're also including things like how is something going to fit over your curves? Like what is the ease and the allowance that you're going to get on the sides? What is the actual like quality of the fabric look like? Is it going to hold its shape? Is it going to be really drapey? Is it going to be easy to wash? Is it not going to be easy to wash? And then obviously we need to get into things like the fiber construction and like what is something made out of? What is the difference between wool? What is the difference between polyamide and polyester? You know, how does something like nylon work into this? What are things like viscose and, you know, rayon? Like are they natural fibers? Are they not natural fibers? Why can I not use lily sugar and cream for a top? Which you can, but it's scratchy. Yeah, there's just, I guess like the technicalities in knitting are much more specific. And when you talk about patterns in crochet versus patterns in knit, and I've purchased both and I've used both and I've found it really like fun to work from. I've never been someone who wants to like make my own designs. I'm not someone who is like remotely interested in jerry rigging something together myself, right? So I've always relied on patterns. And I will say in crochet patterns, it often says use a weight for blank for this and you'll need 750 yards. Or it'll be like use 2, you know, sport weight, blah, blah, blah. Or like I need 5 balls of this bulky yarn, you know, with this brand and this thing to make this blanket. And so that's usually what I did. And it was usually pretty accessible. And I think, you know, due to the nature of crochet where it tends to be more, you know, again, I don't know if this is true, but like I was just exposed to more like craft big box style projects where it's like cowls made from Red Heart Super Saver, or it's like granny squares made by Karen 1 Pound of Love. And so that's really accessible to buy. And like, I just buy the same thing. Whereas in knitting, it's really almost like the norm and the expectation that you're going to learn how to do yarn substitutions. And to do a yarn substitution accurately, you're really going to have to understand things like gauge and drape and blocking and post blocking and like what kind of blocking do you want to do? You want to do steam blocking, wet blocking? And like really understanding different fiber contents and how they differ, understanding your tension and understanding how like your tension compares to their tension, and understanding like ease and all that extra stuff, which I feel like is good to learn. So my feedback, if you are a crocheter who is intimidated by knitting, is like, yes, understand that it's far more like stuff on paper that you might be used to, but it's not anything more difficult than what you already know. It's just more of the same thing. So if you already know the difference between like acrylic and wool and cotton, you can also learn the difference between tencel and rayon and nylon, you know, and viscose and, you know, all the other stuff. Like it's just more of the same thing. It's not any more difficult to understand. I just do think that when I learned how to crochet, a lot of those details were omitted, and I don't know why. I'm not sure, but I do think that's part of why I was hesitant to pick up the knitting needles. It was just like, it seemed like there was so much more information, and there is, but it's not hard. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Whew. Okay, I will also say the reason why knitting seems much more unappealing or like much more complicated or intimidating to a crocheter is that it's a lot of garments. I think a lot of knitters specifically tend to do garment knitting, cardigans, sweaters, pullovers. And listen, a crocheter has not shied down from a challenge. If I could show you the number of blankets, I've seen people crochet like huge granny square blankets, you know, rounded around circle blankets, like eyelet, lace, shawls. Like the second project I made was like this incredible lace charted shawl. I was obsessed with Japanese crochet patterns, and like those diagrams are equally confusing, right? If you can learn how to read a Japanese crochet pattern, you can read a lace chart. They're like the same thing. And if anything, I have actually really enjoyed the crochet versions because they're physical demonstrations of like the knots. So I do like that. But I will say, like, despite the fact that a lot of crocheters do make these big Afghans and like, you know, huge Tunisian crochet blankets and like shawls and wraps and stuff like that, there are fewer like garment projects. I think a lot of the garment projects tend to be like big oversized sweaters, and they're made with, again, that thick yarn. It's a lot of this traditional thick yarn, and I've seen beautiful stuff. I've made like, you know, these really cute shrugs, you know, with like the fishnet shrugs. You know, I can't really make like a small bandeau top or like a little bralette because there's just like a lot of tissue here, and I just don't, I'm like not convinced it's gonna work. But I will say that like I do see a lot of garments being made, and I will also say that a lot of those garments look pretty stiff. And again, I think this has to do with the culture around the yarn that you're using. If it's like a weight for yarn, like a thicker yarn, you might be disinclined to pick up like a fingering weight yarn and then make a whole cashmere sweater. And I think a lot of knitting tends to be much more on the thinner side. Not that there aren't bulky knits, but I will say when we talk about knitting in general, worsted weight is considered like a heavy kind of yarn. Most garments I don't think are made at that heavy of a weight. And they're seen as like easy knits because they tend to work up really fast. You're using like a 5 or a 6 millimeter needle, and it's moving along. And I think when I hear people say, oh, worsted weight to make a sweater, like that's easy, it'll fly off the needles. You're like, what are you talking about? Like, actually, what are you talking about? Because it looks like so much more work. It physically feels as grueling as crocheting like a sweater. It's the same thing. And garments like physically are much more tricky to construct. Like, I don't know, like a blanket is a flat rectangle and there's very few ways to like fuck up a rectangle. Like not that you can't, you know, make the blanket a little bit wonky and like, what is it? Catawampus? Like, not that a blanket can't come out catawampus, but I will say, like, there are a myriad of ways to mess up, you know, a shirt. Like, you can make the neckline messed up, you can get, like, the armpit holes too tight, you can make it, like, a weird length, you know, maybe the front and back look weird. Like, there are a ton of ways that, like, actual shirts and, you know, pants and skirts and, like, wearables can go wrong. Like, there are bralettes, I know, but a lot of those are also made to measure. Right? A lot of the crochet patterns are like make something until it's like able to stretch around your waist and do it in a multiple of 4. But when it comes to knitting patterns, I don't see a ton of them like that. So yeah, that's definitely another one, which is that, you know, the garments and like the weight of the yarn definitely makes knitting look a lot more tedious, shall we say? Tedious and like detail oriented and complicated and like maybe not as easy to like finagle. And generally, like there are fewer resources. Like, as a crocheter, I was really used to having a lot of free resources, like free patterns, free walkthroughs, free classes. A lot of like, again, craft stores will do like drop-in classes where you can just like go in and like they'll teach you how to make a project. Amigurumi books. Again, there are a lot of PDFs of like full scan books online. Again, I don't know, not gonna propose that you guys go find like pirated copies of these like PDF books, but if you want them, they are accessible online. And so I think it was really easy for me to find a lot of like my level of instructional material online. Not to say that there are not a lot of like free knitting materials online, but a lot of them tend to be like text-based. So a lot of like blog posts, a lot of like knitting books at your local library store, or you have to like go to a yarn store and then like take a drop-in knitting class. But a lot of those knitting classes do also cost money. Not to say that the crochet classes don't cost money, but there are quite a lot of free ones as opposed to not so many free knitting classes. I just don't see a ton of those. As you know, as someone who was learning to knit recently, I didn't see a ton of free classes. Whereas when I was crocheting, I did see like a few more in my area. Again, I was living in Boston at the time, so maybe it's like a younger crowd or like, you know, there are more community resources. Like those are all possible. So I'm not saying like this is universally true, but for me at least, I felt like it was easier to pick up crocheting because there were a lot of things at my like accessibility level, like a lot of TikTok tutorials, a lot of YouTube tutorials, you know, a lot of like in-person events that were just like low barrier to entry, very easy get in, get out, like you weren't really beholden to anyone. And I think the last thing I want to say is that, and this is an ineffable quality, right? Like again, we're not pointing fingers, we're not saying that this is true universally, but I got more of like an old school vibe from knitting and a new school vibe from crochet. And I think, do I still think it's true? I guess I still would say it feels true because crochet still feels very youthful. It still feels very like younger kids are reclaiming crochet as like a new hobby that's in. Again, this feels like very apropos for pandemic times. So people were like, hey, this feels like something that like would really help for the mental health, really help as like a thing to do, and it feels really fun and like you have a creative outlet. But I will say I just feel like there's a lot of ingenuity with crochet. Again, like this is just like I see a lot of like young cool artists subverting expectations, doing a lot of like freeform crochet, a lot of like scrappy projects, a lot of like 3D sculptural projects, people doing like art, right? Like Alexandria Massey is one that I'm thinking of who like is in museums and like, I know there's a lot of like TikTok famous crochet artists who are like really with the times and doing really fun, cool, like new stuff and happy to share. Not really, I think there's a culture of like not wanting to gatekeep. Again, I don't know if this is like a Gen Z thing. Like I'm really dating myself. I feel like everything that I see is like very much so just in my own small worldview, which is, again, that's everyone's experience. I'm not like insecure about it or anything, but again, I don't want to make like sweeping judgments. This is just like how I felt, which is that I felt like as a crocheter, people were more willing to share their resources, more willing to share like a full list of them. Like they had like the full like to know it page. Like here are all of the things that I, you know, would link in my bio. Like these are my favorite hooks. These are my favorite yarns. This is where I get my, you know, coupons. This is where I learned how to make the amigurumi. Like there are just all kinds of little things here and there. And if you want to know how to do something, I'm just going to show it to you. Whereas I think in knitting, and again, this is just like my experience, but I have seen a lot more of like people need to learn on their own, or like no one wants to ask their grandmother how to do things, or like I figured this out the hard way. And this is, again, not to say that there are not a bajillion million really helpful YouTube tutorials out there. There are a bajillion. But I guess there's a lot less like unsolicited advice for tricky things. And again, I don't know if it's like the space that I'm in, so I'm again hedging because I don't want to make it sound like knitting people are mean, or like knitting people are gatekeeping. But I feel like when patterns became very explicit and long, and like people were making like 16-page patterns for like a simple raglan sweater, I've heard in the community a lot of knitters be like, you know, it's kind of exhausting, like everyone wants everything explained, and like as a pattern designer, everyone's always asking you questions, and I'm not saying that that's not true. I do think everyone wants everything explained. I do think people are a lot less willing to do their own research. I do think people have a lot less access and like tolerance to ask someone in their life to help. I do think it's a lot harder to like, you know, write a pattern because now you have to explain things as if no one knows how to do anything. I think those are all true. And yet I also think that that's fine. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm the beginner who really benefits, but I don't know. I do just feel like a lot of times with crochet, it starts from square one. It's like, how do you make a slip knot? Every single tutorial is like how to make a slip knot. And then we're going to also take you all the way to the end where we make a cardigan. But I think with knitting, there's a lot of assumed knowledge. It reminds me a little bit of sewing, where it'll just say like, attach the facing. Serge, join invisibly. And it's like, I don't know what that means. I don't know how I want to do, like, you know? So it's a little bit like old school, new school. If you talk to like elder knitters, and I don't mean like elder knitters as in like they're elderly, I mean like elder goth, or like, you know, elder millennial, like it's endearing, right? There are people who have been in this game for a long time. And I do think they tend to make the complaint that younger people always want their hands held, or, you know, these patterns are always getting like longer and longer. People are always asking more questions. They want more support. They want more this and that. And again, maybe this is because I'm new. Maybe it's because I'm a former educator. Maybe it's because I'm autistic. Like, I don't know what it is about my identity that like enjoys that. And I don't feel like it's pejorative to be like, yeah, people want more help and we should give them more help. So I felt like as a crocheter, the world just felt a little bit more like we're all learning this right now. Like, it's all okay. Like, you know, there are no stupid questions. Like, no one knows how to do a slip knot from the womb. No one knows how to do a magic ring. Like, I have to look this stuff up all the time. Whereas with knitting, I feel like the assumption is you'll be a lot more self-efficacious and be like, I don't know how to do this. I'm going to fill in the blanks myself, which again is fine. But the mentality just feels a little bit more like old school, new school. And like for the same reason, I would say like new school stuff is also a little bit petty. So just to be like even, I will also say the new school world of designers and like knitwear people and crochet people tend to be a lot more sensitive to things like copying and inspiration, and where that line tends to be drawn, I think it's a little bit more conservative, as opposed to like, it's fine, we're all inspired by everyone, which is like the old school approach where like no one's really got hurt feelings over spilled milk. Whereas I think more of the younger creators tend to be like, well, I just released a pattern with stripes and like short sleeve shirts with like a contrast piping, and you also just released that, which is like really suspicious because like, you know, blah, blah. And so you do see like clashes. I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm just saying I've noticed certain things that have made it a little bit harder as a crocheter to go into knit, because I feel like the judgment has made it a little bit hard for me to want to ask questions, right? Like I'm a little bit reluctant to be like, I need a lot of help, or I don't know if this pattern is actually going to have the support that I need, because I am someone who needs a lot of explicit instruction. So that's it. I didn't really want to get like too contentious here today. I don't know if any of these are hot takes, but hopefully this was fun. And if you are a crocheter who wants to get into knit, I hope this has relieved some of your fears and at least laid out for you in full completion like kind of the differences. Again, if I had this list, I maybe would have felt like, okay, like that's what I'm feeling too, and maybe it's not fully warranted, or maybe it's just like in my head. It's not in your head. If you're someone who's ever picked up crochet but you've never learned to knit, I would love to know like how, why, you know, do you want to, do you not want to, are you happy where you are? If you're a knitter, you've never crocheted, like does this feel like I'm slandering you? I don't know, but I don't know, like again, I'm just speaking from my own experience, and I just wish I didn't put it off for so long. Like I really wish I learned how to knit earlier. I remember as of last year, I got tickets for Rhinebeck with my friend and my husband, and I was just gonna go for shits and giggles and be like, I wonder what it'll be like. I think it'll be fun. And I remember my husband being like, you're gonna learn how to knit, it'll be really fun. And like by this time next year, you're gonna have like a ton of sweaters and you're gonna make everything that you wanna make, and it'll be really fun, and you'll be able to design stuff and it'll be like no big deal to you. And I remember at the time I was like, you are full of shit. There's no way I'm gonna learn how to knit. It's so complicated. Well, and I made this whole list. I was like, people don't like show you how to do stuff. It's so expensive. Like, it's so difficult to knit with tiny little yarn, and I'm not gonna understand how to read a pattern. I made this full list basically of excuses as to why it was unreasonable for me to want to knit or learn how to knit, that people were gatekeeping from me, that the community was not gonna be like, you know, helpful for me as like a young person. And here I am, not 6 months later, being like, no, those are actually not all true. Or they can be true to an extent, but it's never going to be so true that like you are blocked from learning this new skill. So hopefully this helps someone like assuage some of their fears and be like, put a face to the name and be like, yeah, this is the problem that we have, and like, here's what you can do about it, or this is the problem that we have, and it's just like a perception thing, and it's not really physically going to stop you that much, or it's not really as bad as you think it is. Because again, it's not as bad as you think it is. Knitting is really fun. If you can crochet, you can knit. If you have two, okay, well, you do need two hands. So if you can hold, you know, with two hands, and you have like decent motor skill and you can like follow directions, you can learn how to knit. I have a whole video on beginner friendly knit patterns that I will link up above, and you know, hopefully we'll start there. But I do highly recommend and implore that you give it a try. You know, maybe start with some like thrifted materials instead of like having to go out and like do everything by yourself. Ask your mom and your aunt and your grandma if they have any, like, I'm sure someone in your life has some knitting needles that they can loan you, just to see what it's like. And don't give up immediately, because it is like an entirely like physically new sensation. So it is going to be hard. But I just generally don't want there to be this like rift between crochet and knit, because so many people learn crochet, and I guess it's like the gateway drug. I'm hoping it's the gateway drug. I just don't want there to be like a gap, and I don't want that gap to continue, because I was in that gap for a long time and I felt like I wasted a lot of my life being in that gap. And I regret it, I really do. So that is everything. It's long-winded. I'm sorry again for how like disorganized this was, but I've had this like weighing on me for a while, and I feel like I just need to dispel the rumors. Okay, so that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye now.